The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with KTOO, present the 2023 World Affairs Forum, Immigration, Detention, and Power, Addressing Bias and Prejudice. In this lecture, Reclaiming Our Sense of Humanity After the Weaponization of Public Health Through the Use of Title 42 at the U.S. Mexico border, Associate Professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, Dr. William Arrocha, speaks about how a little-known provision of U.S. health law was leveraged for political will at the expense of migrants.
Thank you, Heather. Well, before I start the presentation, I do want to thank every member from this council that had the courage and the patience during COVID. We were invited, how many years ago now, right? And here we are, so thank you a million, and they've been treating us, with such generosity, and thank you for those from the community that came too, because this wouldn't have happened with the vision, right? So I really want to make sure we thank them enormously. There's not enough thanks. So my presentation today is, if we can, and I think at least in this card we can, reclaim our sense of humanity after the weaponization of public health through the use of Title 42 at the U.S. Mexico border. It's not, applied anymore, but it was a very aggressive policy that I would go through. And the main focus of the presentation today really is going to be on the discourse that anchored the policies of Title 42. So you will have to bear with discourses that definitely reflect a language that is uncomfortable for those of us with a sense of humanity. And this is a discourse that comes from high leadership, and that leadership is still seeking to be, again, in the White House. So bear with me. It really is, to a good extent, hate speech, right? And we will hear examples of that. So, but I do have to go back, just like my colleague did yesterday, to remind us about the causes, the deep-rooted causes of forced migration and irregular migration, which are not exactly the same thing, but they do share the same struggle of exclusiveness and inclusiveness. Really quick, right? Really quick. I mean, they're coming from states, from nation states that have been suffering from chronic structural violence. And it's not getting better. That's just the reality. And I'm going to just go through some aspects of that structural violence that, we need to be aware. These states, the sending states, right, of forced and irregular migration, have a political economy that really perpetrates by design. I know it sounds conspirational, but it's true. By design, poverty and inequality, right? And it's been going on for decades. Therefore, there's an inadequate access to basic needs like food, shelter, and healthcare that many of us take for granted. There are institutionalized forms of racial discrimination and gender bias that take multiple shapes, forms of repression. There is obviously a severe lack of agency by the majority of the population that basically wakes up one morning and says, we have to leave, period, out of desperation. That last piece of agency is what gives them the capability to actually leave. So there's still agency, but it's one that they have to take through the very perilous journeys to find some kind of shelter, of better life. Environmental degradation. These are states that do not have the adaptability, the capability to address issues that many other communities actually thrive from a development perspective from that quote-unquote degradation, meaning that degradation becomes a source of investment for new technologies, for new community structure and so forth. For most of these people, it's just basically their livelihoods being pulled off of them where they can no longer survive. Literally speaking, they can no longer survive. And then, of course, constant political instability, right? Added to general violence from both state and non-state actors. And by the way, in the Americas, general violence by most Latin American states, based on the 1984 Cartagena Declaration, is already cause for starting the process of claiming asylum. So it's a little more generalized in that sense. It's not binding for all states, but some states have inserted as part of the domestic law. And then I do have to remind us, and we also were reminded yesterday by a colleague, there is factually clear economic and political pressure from the United States. And it's constant, and it's at many different levels. And we cannot detach from this. We cannot ignore it. And it's across parties, right? It's not one or the other party. It's really ingrained in the foreign policy that reflects a particular political economy. We cannot deny it. We can't ignore it. It's one of the main structural problems that most of these sending countries have. So these are some of the root causes that we have to be aware of. The solution for them, well, that's a whole other issue, but at least the awareness is fundamental to understand, why these people are taking a decision that most of us, wouldn't even fathom to take, right? So let me take you to Title 42 to jump really quick on it. It's, as some of our colleagues know and have worked with it, it really is part of an old Health Act, 1940s Health Act, that basically, without going into too many details, so it's Title 42 and it's Section 265, that basically states the suspension of entries and imports from designated places to prevent spread of communicable diseases. That's the basic language of it. There's more details, right? It was never used prior to COVID-19. And yes, it is true that in the imaginary of most people, obviously there needed to be some way of stopping, if it could happen, the ravages from this virus. But as we're going to see in this presentation, it really was not a public health measure. It was an exclusionary measure. It was part of a very dark chapter in immigration policies in this country that basically used public health to focus on the individual itself as a public health threat. And so the migrant went from being a criminal alien to being a security threat to being itself a threat to the health of the rest of the country, right? So it elevated the dehumanization of migrants, of irregular and forced migrants mainly. So just a little more details. The title, Title 42 was applied through actually 7 different orders that were issued by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. So it wasn't just one order. So these orders were revisited, adjusted. Sometimes they were in a way more punitive. Other times when it came to children, they kind of would adjust and then they'll come back. So it was this constant, set of orders that obviously those that were impacted by them would feel those adjustments. The first order was issued on March 20, 2020, and the last order on April 20, 2022. So it went through this administration too, right? Even though it was implemented by the former administration, this administration lived with it, used it for 2 years. I just want us to be aware of this. And it actually had to go to court, right? It had to be sued, basically, to finally accept the fact that it wasn't really working and to do what it really was designed to do, which was to exclude and deter, really the migration from the global south. So again, these orders suspended the right to introduce certain non-citizens. So it wasn't a cut-through order, right? So it was certain non-citizens attempting to enter the United States from Canada and Mexico, not just Mexico, right? Regardless of country of origin, at or between ports of entry. So that was the main focus. Meaning, if you were coming by air and reaching another port that wasn't through the ports of entry, and you had the proper documents, you could come in, which is something that occurred a lot with migrant labor. So migrant labor that had different labor visas were able to still come in, right, into the country. Why? Well, the labor obviously was extremely needed, because that labor was the one that was keeping food on the table of most Americans. So again, it was really hyper-focused on those who did not have proper travel documentation or visas in general terms. So yes, in essence, it allowed for the rapid expulsion of unauthorized border crossers and asylum seekers, which found themselves in limbo at a border that was already in a very, traumatic state with what I'll go a little bit more detail, which was commonly known as the Remain in Mexico policy, right? Which also remained many years later. Now, the legal scope of these are expulsions. The expulsions mean that these individuals were not receiving an order of deportation. Deportation is a very difficult word to digest. However, an order of deportation opens the door for process. So it opens the door for the individual to have the possibility of using the judicial system to reach some kind of outcome. Here, it was just an expulsion, right? So you could go back, right? But that also meant that there was no possibilities to request, the right to stay. And of course, a lot of individuals would be expelled, and then if they could come back in, they'll try to come back in. So the numbers of those who were expelled reflect, in many cases, multiple reentries of these individuals, right? Now, I do want to state that their biometrics were taken, even though they were not being deported, all their biometrics were taken. What is going to happen with that information? Well, we'll see. Who knows? But obviously, it's not going to just be in a file. So yes, and of course, there was no processing of asylum claims, period, which was already very difficult to carry on. The system was absolutely, almost barbaric, where people had to put numbers on papers and be in a line in Mexico trying to get in to be listened, right? So in essence, basically, Title 8 of the U.S. Code, right, which outlines the state's obligations, there's no not rights, to process the handling of migrants in general terms, including asylum seekers, was suspended, period. Was simply suspended. So for me, the important thing is the construction of this as a weapon. And I'm going to start with how the CDC itself reacted to show the shock, even in CDA, of how this system was absolutely one of the most powerful weapons that have existed to deter the unwanted migrants from the global south. So it has been now pretty well established that the CDC in general terms was not behind of the penning of these orders, even though they were the vehicle that was used for these orders. The CDC director at that time, Robert Redfield, for example, stated multiple times, including to a Senate subcommittee on the coronavirus crisis, that he did not support travel bans in general terms, arguing that they were ineffective, quote unquote, in preventing the spread of COVID-19 and would create a false sense of insecurity, which is one of the essential kernels of this policy, right? So we need to increase fear to a sense of insecurity. So it's not enough to depict these individuals as criminal aliens or as threats to the state. You need that sense of insecurity that if they come in, COVID-19 will not be able to be controlled. The director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Division of Global Migration and Quarantine, Martin Cetron, told the panel during a hearing of the House Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus crisis that took place in June 2022, that the idea of the invoking of Title 42, this is public, came from outside the CDC subject matter experts. Right. So where did this come from? Well, it wasn't necessarily epidemiologists that were dealing with this. It wasn't necessarily people from the medical practice. It was people from, in my opinion, a very dark political universe, to be very honest with you. And when you see those quotes, you will understand what I'm saying. It's a very dark one. Szechuan himself, this is public record, has claimed that the order, and now the documents are out there, that the order was literally speaking handed to them, right, through the Vice President's office, at that time Vice President Pence, and crafted by the team of one of the most powerful senior advisors that the White House has had, Stephen Miller. Literally speaking, crafted in their office. So taking language from prior, orders to deal with, in general terms, pandemics, swiftly crafting it. I mean, if you have read the orders, they're actually pretty sloppy. I mean, really, from a legal perspective, they're one of the most sloppiest documents you can imagine. I mean, any good attorney could dismantle them. A lot of the judges that had, that read them were absolutely shocked, particularly the last one that threw the order. I mean, he was like, what is this? I mean, this is just ridiculous, right? So, yeah, but it was created by, a group of people that really, really have a deep hatred towards a certain kind of migration. I mean, it's deep into their, it's already ingrained in their consciousness. It's not a subconscious issue here. So let me take you to a discourse about politics of Title 42. The first, of course, is President Trump's victory was fundamental to start the process becoming part of the biopolitics of the use of multiple instruments, including Title 42, right? And it was one of the campaigns that was fueled by the most xenophobic language you can imagine. So when he's launching his campaign under the motto, Make America Great Again, he made explicit claims about Mexico sending problematic individuals to the United States, labeled them as rapists and criminals. We know it's on record now, right? I mean, he's very proud of it, by the way. He still is. His dehumanization rhetoric extended beyond Mexicans to migrants from all, I'm quoting him, from all over South and Latin America, and potentially even the Middle East, which we know then was part of his famous or infamous Muslim band. He characterized migrant caravans, which are really important because the migrant caravans that started in Honduras are really to protect the livelihood, the safety of all these migrants, but particularly women, girls, and boys, particularly, which are the ones that suffer, the most atrocious, acts that we were reminded yesterday by our colleague. For that president, and still today, those caravans, I quote him, equal invasions and infestations. So he was starting to, plant that seed. He didn't quote it once. I have it once on my notes. It was multiple times in multiple media. So, you can imagine the fear that this was, being instilled, particularly by those who see and read a particular kind of media. For example, in 2019, I chose this quote because obviously, they're all shocking, but during discussions with lawmakers in the White House about immigration policy, President Trump escalated his dehumanizing language, further labeling migrants as animals. Now, this is language that we're hearing again in other countries too, by the way. It's a big issue in many European countries. This is the same language that Orbán uses, for example, right, in Hungary. Erdogan is starting to use it. in Northern Africa, the president of Tunisia is using the same language, it's the same, script. He contended that these individuals were not to be considered as people and accused them of bringing disease. He used this quote at least 27 times in different media. So these people are carriers of disease, right? In the meantime, he didn't know exactly what to do with COVID-19, right? I mean, if you recall the day that he was saying that maybe you could inject, a solution to clean to try to deal with COVID-19, and yet apparently these were the people that were bringing that disease. Throughout his presidency, the president and his close advisors were resolute in their belief that migrants, often referred to as hordes of people, invading and infesting the country, quote unquote, must be stopped at any cost for the United States to make America great. Those are his words. So the discourse of this, of course, one that comes to my mind, and I know my colleagues know it, and I'm sure many of you here know it, but I do have to remind us, again, in that same meeting, this was January 11, 2018, just a day before meeting with the Prime Minister of Norway, President Trump lamented, this is open, the presence of individuals from what he termed shithole countries, specifically citing Haiti, El Salvador, and Africa as a big country, right? Because I think in his mind, Africa is a big country. Not just his mind, unfortunately many other minds. And he contrasted this by expressing his preference. That was next to the Prime Minister, right? He expressed his preference for Norwegians by bluntly stating that, I open quote, we should have more people from Norway, encapsulating his outright, of course, white nativist perspective on immigration and the ideal American citizen, right? Now I'm going to take you to the architect. Obviously, we know that he has his own mind. He doesn't necessarily need to have many architects to build his building of hate, but he did rely before and during the campaign from this very young advisor who, by the way, his family comes from genocide, right, that occurred in Germany, which is, very sad. Stephen Miller, right? So I'm just going to share with you some of the quotes that he put out there, before, during the campaign, and after. But again, reminding you that the power of this individual was extraordinary, and I'm really not overstating it. He had carte blanche. The president gave him carte blanche to communicate. I mean, let me put it this way. Even the vice president would make sure that his agenda had time to listen to Stephen Miller if Stephen Miller was requesting to see Vice President Pence. It's known, it's public. This is not a storytelling session. So just a couple of quotes for discussion today. In an interview on Fox News in January 2019, Miller will state, so this is 2019, will state that we have a very real invasion taking place at our southern border, right? This is a reflection of a problem that we're having with immigration that's been going on for years, which is, and this goes beyond parties, which is that securitization of immigration. Meaning that today, in this country, the act of migrating or immigrating, wanting to stay here, is now part of the national security agenda, right? So everything goes to the Department of Homeland Security, and once a state embraces national security to deal with these issues, well, that means that the legal aspects, they can wait, right? This is national security. That's a big constraint that we have today, and that I don't foresee in the short term to finish. Quite the opposite. I think that the securitization, as we have this chat, is increasing exponentially, not just at the border, because there's no such thing, by the way, today as an external border. The border has come in, right? So the securitization of migration happens. It can happen around the corner here, or it can happen in El Paso, Texas. I mean, there's no differentiation anymore of the border. This 100-mile issue is gone, finished, erased. In a speech to the Conservative Political Action Conference in February 2016, he stated that immigrants are an invasion and that they were coming to change our country. So he was very clear that he wanted to craft a discourse and policy to dictate what was it meant to be American, right? To bring back this idea that never really fully happened of what it was to be an American. In a speech to the Conservative Political Action Conference in February 2021, Miller would state that, quote unquote, Title 42 is also necessary to protect our national security. So he's elevating, right, a public health policy at a national security level. Migrants would be carrying diseases or could be terrorists. We cannot allow them to enter the country unchecked. This is also framed, which I need to remind you of or to share with you, with something that has been occurring from the 1980s onwards, regardless of who holds the presidency, of what we call today the criminalization of irregular migration, right? So even though, technically speaking, certain violations of immigration law, as we were reminded yesterday, can be misdemeanors, the reality is that beyond the legal aspects, the dominant discourse today is these individuals are breaking the law, right? That's the main thing that they're doing. I don't care why they want to come in. I don't care if they want a better job, if they want better wages. They're breaking the law, right? And so there's this articulation between discourse, between collective consciousness, and of course, the way, the forcing of the law through other policies. One of them that is very ironic, called, which is back, secure communities, right? Where individuals basically can be picked up due to other misdemeanors that are not linked to the violation of an immigration law and be detained and deported without, by the way, informing their families. I've been involved in the city of Salinas, that is right next to Monterrey, where I live, with amicus briefings in the courts, where mothers would drop their children to school in the morning and then stopped by police before, by the way, which I've worked a lot, California became a sanctuary state and Salinas became a sanctuary city where they would be stopped by a police because maybe the tail light wasn't working, and that woman would be taken to the police station. There would be, of course, two sets of records. One would be the FBI and one would be the Department of Homeland Security. And if in the record that showed that that individual was coming through the country without proper documentation or had crossed the border unlawfully multiple times, that individual at that moment has recourse, if everything goes well, to one phone call. One. To whom does she call? The school? Her daughter that's in school? An attorney? Which attorney? This is a different system, as my attorney colleagues know. So which attorney, who does she call? That individual would be taken to a detention center in Tacoma, thousands of miles away, where the family members don't even know. Imagine that the child is waiting for her at school, and the principal doesn't know his mom. Like those cases, thousands, and our attorney colleagues know it, thousands. As a reminder, secure communities is not gone. Some states have pushed back, right? But it's not gone. As we're having this conversation, it's happening. To children, to uncles, to wives, to families, it's happening as we're having this conversation. So that is part of the criminalization of irregular migration, right? Now, in an interview on CNN in April 2022, he stated that, quote unquote, we will not allow the spread of COVID-19 to be facilitated by the influx of migrants. To be facilitated by the influx of migrants. Mind you, they could barely manage COVID-19 in the country because the policies were not proper, period. right? And in a speech to the Republican National Convention on August 2020, he would state that we will not allow terrorists, so think about the image now. Not only they're an infestation, they're terrorists. And we know in our collective consciousness the shock that we still live today from 9/11, right? At least in this country. In Europe, trust me, it's before 9/11, right? And today we know what's happening in other places. So we will not allow terrorists or criminals, so that's part of the criminalization of irregular migration, to enter our country under the guise of asylum. So he brings in, right, something that has been apparently very dear to this country, at least at the level of the Northeast, never the southern border, by the way, never. The Northeast has been different when it comes to asylum than the southern border, in its reception, in its processing, and so forth. Not necessarily legally speaking, but in the welcoming or uncomfortable processing of, really, yes, I guess I have to process you, right? Compared to that, yes, you're welcome, why not? Come in, right? So he's now bringing asylum into this aspect, which is an obligation under international and domestic law. It's not a privilege. It's not a right that the state is granting itself. It's an obligation, right? We have a 1980 Refugee Act. We have the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees and its 1967 Protocol. Again, this is not like, oh my God, we really forgot about it. No, it's right there. So this is the kind of discourse that was carefully accompanied by very carefully crafted policy. So, after 3 years of denouncing the orders by human rights organizations, the United Nations itself, that normally is not heard here, medical experts, epidemiologists, including the CDC and former CDC experts that came public, as well as taking the Department of Homeland Security to court 10 times, in the November 15, 2022 ruling, U.S. Federal District Court Judge Emmett Sullivan struck down, finally, Title 42, stating that it was, what a surprise, arbitrary and capricious. For a judge to use those words, it just shows you the level of sloppiness of those orders. And a violation, of course, of due process under the Administrative Procedure Act, meaning the violation of Title 8, tout court. Sullivan found that the CDC Title 42 was being used for immigration enforcement purposes and rather than public health purposes. Meaning, we needed a judge that applied the law and the facts in the proper manner to remind us that this was not a public health policy, right? Which at least is a positive aspect, right? I mean, that was a very positive reaction. So these are a little bit of the unveiling the disguise of the 42 that Judge Sullivan came to, right? So the CDC failed to adequately consider the availability of other public health measures, which in the past were used for many other, flus, the Asian flu being one, that could have been used to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 at the border. In fact, the CDC had acknowledged that the risk of COVID-19 transmission at the border was low. The Mexican government itself was acknowledging that at first. It was spreading, but the transmission from migrants that were moving across was lower than many individuals that were living across the border, in their own communities. The CDC failed to provide adequate data or analysis to support its claim that Title 42 was necessary to protect public health. The CDC's decision to invoke Title 42 was not based on sound public health principles, but rather on political considerations. And the use of Title 42 was causing irreparable harm to migrants, including families with children who were being expelled to dangerous and uncertain situations in their home countries. So that was a pretty darn big slap, right? So what were the results? I'm almost getting to the end. Obviously, even we're living it today, the increase of fear and deterrence through new forms of punishment. A dramatic increase in the vulnerabilities and trauma suffered by migrants. 2.8 million expulsions, including 215,000 families. By the way, those numbers, most of the time, are actually much lower than the real numbers. That's what we can gather, right, from different NGOs and the state, whatever. And the expulsions, of course, from the rosters of Border Patrol. 6,000 unaccompanied children. And I want to note, these expulsions took place despite provisions of the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act that was put by President Bush. They were ignoring that act. They still ignore that act, by the way, which requires the government to protect children who arrived at the border without a parent or legal guardian. It's an act, it's there. Totally ignored. The majority were expelled back to Mexico, keeping them stuck in limbo, leaving them in a state of uncertainty due to the controversial migration protection protocols. It's the most ironic name that you can imagine. Commonly known as the Remain in Mexico policy, right? Which was really an act of realpolitik from the Trump administration to the Mexican administration, basically telling them either you stop them at your border or we will cancel negotiations for a new free trade agreement. And not only that, and he could go through, the president said, we will sanction you at an economic level that will hurt your economy like you have no idea. And the president had the power to do that. And he showed it with some European countries, so there was real fear from the Mexican administration. So yes, they basically bowed and bent to this president and became de facto a third safe country, not de jure, which is very problematic. Not that I'm a big proponent necessarily of the third safe country. So of course, what did this happen? Migrants had limited access to protections and faced institutionalized and social violence. And of course, thousands were flown back to their countries of origin. So the expulsion wasn't just exactly at the border, right? Haitians were expelled already within the border, for example. And we remember those images of Border Patrol with their horses, even though they claimed they did not, whipping Haitians trying to cross the river, which for us, that it's an image that reminds us that our history has not always been, so wonderful at many levels when it comes to race. So the violation was the principle of non-refoulement, right? So you're basically expelling without due process them to conditions of, perilous conditions that start from entering the Mexican border. I mean, Ciudad Juárez and Tijuana, two of the most dangerous cities in the world, like we were reminded yesterday. This is no joke, right? And of course, and their own countries. Venezolanos were expelled to their countries. Haitians were flown back to Haiti. That is, in my opinion, unconscionable. So in essence, Title 42 became an expansion of the quote-unquote beautiful wall that Trump wanted to build to exclude those who he deemed as infestations. And it worked. It really did work. So what are the results? Again, from a legal perspective, the rule of law prevailed, and a precedent has been set, hopefully, to avoid future arbitrary and capricious orders in the name of public health. We shall see. However, what still prevails, and we cannot forget, through new forms of biopolitics, is the continuous militarization of the U.S. border, the securitization of migration, and the criminalization of irregular migration. Those have not stopped. What also prevails is the normalization. This, for me, is very delicate. The normalization of the narrative that migrants from the global south are not welcomed in the United States. As a result of the present administration, and the result is that the present administration, I apologize, has put forward draconian policies that I will not discuss today, maybe during our panel, that make it almost impossible today for migrants from certain countries, from the global south, to even claim asylum. And the policies today, in my opinion, are even more effective than Title 42 to basically build a much larger wall for them to come in. So what are we going to do about this? Because in these forums, we have to obviously talk about different policies. And let me be honest with you, I could give you theories and paradigms. I teach them. I could give you potential policies. I've written some. We have colleagues. But I'm going to really spare you that list. I'm going to conclude my intervention with these ideas that I'm going to read because I don't want my thoughts to fly away. And I'm going to say that in this very moment, literally speaking, we find ourselves doing precisely what needs to be done. in this very moment, gathered under the generous shelter extended to us by the institution and the soul of this establishment. And I want to remind you that when you were coming up the staircase, there's these salmons, right, that are engraved on the wall. So just as we observe the salmon's journey, which accompanies us throughout the walls of this staircase, leading us to this hall, we gratefully acknowledge the unwavering support and care from every member of this council and the Juneau community. As foreigners, because we are foreigners, right? I mean, we are foreigners from your home. As foreigners, we have been embraced in your home to reaffirm our shared humanity. As we prepare to depart, some of us will leave really early in the morning, right, tomorrow. As we prepare to depart, for most of us, our paths will lead downstream. Most of us live downstream, not you, but us do, right? Yet the values we share will continue to ripple outwards, dismantling barriers of shame and opening gates for all of humanity to come together. Once more, I'm left to extend my heartfelt gratitude for your gracious hospitality, which in itself exemplifies an act of compassionate migration. Thank you very much.
That was Dr. William Arrocha discussing reclaiming our sense of humanity after the weaponization of public health through the use of Title 42 at the U.S. Mexico border. It was recorded October 14, 2023, at UAS on the unceded territories of the Occoquan on Tlinke Ani as part of the 2023 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Immigration, Detention, and Power, Addressing Bias and Prejudice. Produced by KTOO and the Juneau World Affairs Council in partnership with the University of Alaska Southeast, with support from Poor Alaska Kensington Mine and Ramada by Wyndham.